Welcome back to the Fly Culture Podcast, your weekly look inside the world of fly fishing presented by Pete Tigers. If you're enjoying listening, please consider subscribing.
Jethro Binns has been fishing since the age of 4. He's travelled the UK and beyond with a fly rod specialising in pike and saltwater species. He recently appears and worked on the fly fishing film Taith that centres around a road trip in search of pike. Jethro Binns, welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks. Doing okay. Really excited to be on here, Pete. Thanks so much for having me.
It's fantastic to have you along, and I know in the introduction I talked about your film, which we're going to come on to a little bit later, and I was trying to get really a sense. I'm sitting looking out the window and the sun's shining, and I haven't really gone chasing trout just yet. I've been more having a double-hander in my hands in the hope that I might find a salmon. And I'm sort of waiting for those sorts of moments. But I was talking to a friend this morning on the phone, actually, and with this settled weather that we're actually getting, I'm hoping I might find some rising trout before too long. But I know pike are one of your many passions. And how did you find winter from a pike fishing perspective? And how about from a weather perspective as well, being it generally, certainly down here in Devon, it was a pretty mild winter. How did you find that? How does the weather conditions affect the fishing too?
Yeah, no, I had a really nice winter period actually after the pike. I've just started fishing the Y over the last couple of seasons, and it was a very mild and relatively dry winter up here. Obviously, later on we had a bit more water in the rivers, but early on there were just long extended periods, and the Y level was almost at summer level. So there was definitely plenty of fishing to be had there, and it was great. Got out, had a couple of really good days. No huge pike, a few kind of lower to mid doubles, I'd say, probably a handful, but that's great. I really enjoy the winter fishing for the pike now, rather than I've had my fair share of time sat on a boat in Langorse braving it and just getting cold, so I actually really appreciate the ability just to stroll up and down the riverbank, go from spot to spot. And it's been great. And the weather was relatively kind. Got a little bit frustrated at the end of the season, wanted to get out, and there was a bit more colour in the water. But the days I did get out, it was great. And having the opportunity to explore new water is always something that appeals to me.
I guess that must be one of the fun things about the learning process, as you say in fishing, that, I know that you like to fish Langorse, as you mentioned, and Chew and places like that, and then swapping more to moving water. It's a lovely part of that journey that we take, don't we? That we're always looking. Certainly, I think for me, one of the attractions of fishing is that I'm continually trying to learn and understand what I'm doing a little bit better. Have you found that? And did you learn much over that process of fishing the Y over the winter?
Absolutely. Somebody said to me the other day that there's 3 stages of fishing. The first stage is catching as many fish as you can. Then the second stage is catching as big a fish as you can. And then the third stage is how you catch the fish. And, for me, that's why we fly fish, right? I think anybody who's fly fishing is not necessarily making things easy for themselves. But I think I'm now almost at the stage where finding those new challenges and figuring it out and how I catch them is, more important than anything. I'm sure we're going to touch upon some of the fishing we've had in Mexico and the permit fishing there, but that walking and wading and figuring it out for yourself is the thing that most appeals to me. And, likewise, when we talk about fishing the rivers, I like understanding how those eddies are working, where those fish are likely to be holding. And it's more obvious to me where the lies are than necessarily just fishing those big expanses of water and hoping that, maybe you found a bait fish or whatever it may be where the predators are stacked up. But on the river, it's kind of more obvious to make sense that, right, that's where it's going to be. And so I love figuring that out. And that's been a really nice thing to do this winter, starting to understand the why a little bit more. But then you've got the fresh challenges every day, every time you get a bit of rain, the river changes, or that eddy's not there, or it's much bigger, or whatever. So, that learning element of fishing is huge, and those new challenges, whether it be a new species or a new bit of water, is really important to me.
Nice.
So, yeah, I do love it.
Nice. And what did you take from that season, that winter season of the Wye? What was the biggest thing you walked away from? I think you've probably alluded to it in the last couple of sentences, but what was it that you most took from this and thought, yeah, now I'm understanding the differences between what I'd been doing previously?
That's a good question. I think it's just satisfaction of exploring more water. So I was fishing one beat, and then I joined the Ross Club. So I think having that 5 miles to explore and just understanding how different water conditions affect different, the fish holding patterns, and just that sense of excitement about going out and not quite knowing what to expect. I fished for pike for long enough to know that you can catch fish in different ways every day. You can catch, there's no one way to catch pike, right? You can catch on a floating line with a long leader, or you can catch them on a DI7 and a super short leader. So just figuring out those challenges. I think actually, do you know what? I think the most satisfying bit of this week, this season, was perfecting my bow and arrow cast. And there's this one really likely looking spot. I know it holds pike, and it's just, you're covered in hazel trees, and there's no way to backcast at all. But I was there one afternoon on my own, and I figured out that if I folded my line up 3 or 4 times and then did this bow and arrow cast, and suddenly I got one that was perfect. It was like the weighting of the rod was absolutely spot on. There was nothing for the fly to catch on, and I sent this bow and arrow cast probably, I don't know, maybe 8, 9 yards, 10 yards. It really just flew out to the edge of the slack. And then after 2 strips, boom, boom, and the line went tight, and, had a nice, I think it was a double figure fish. But that was probably the most satisfying bit. It's like, okay, this is cool. This is another challenge. And, that's what I love about the river fishing. In particular, I like the fact there's trees around. On the Wye, you've got incredibly steep banks. So I love the technical nature of it and trying to work out, how can I get my fly under that bramble bush? How can I get it under that branch? How can I use the current to swing it round into that position? How can I use a bow and arrow cast, or figure out a bow and arrow cast so that I can get double the distance? So those are the bits that I really love. So I think that was probably the most satisfying fish of the season, in all honesty.
I think I'll be with you on that one. I know I've talked about the bow and arrow cast from a trout angling perspective to many people on this previously, and what a great cast it is to have in your armoury. And that fascinates me. This is what I love. I was actually salmon fishing with a friend. Well, he popped down to see us, Steve, the other day, and Emma and I were fishing. And he's probably one of the most prolific salmon anglers I know down in this part of the world. And he sort of was similarly talking about casting. He said, well, they don't even have names, some of the things that I'm doing, but I'm working out ways to be able to get my fly to the fish with minimal effort, but maximum effect. And that's just music to my ears, hearing you figure those things out. Because I've sort of done longer ones where instead of holding the fly, you can hold the fly line, and then ping it that way. I'm sort of trying to do it on the screen so listeners won't be able to see it, but that can give you distance. But I really like what you've described there, and there's less chance of getting tangled up as well, because of course the method I'm saying that the fly is going to probably be on the ground somewhere as a result of that, so there's chance of it. But stuff like this I love, and this is why I love doing this podcast, to learn myself about things, people doing really cool stuff and it working. So thank you for that. That's made me extremely happy, and I'm going to go and have a play with that a little bit later as well. So thank you for that, Jethro. Did you find then you had to refine your setups. Was there anything regarding moving water versus still water, regarding fly line densities? Did you find patterns had to be changed, or were there any similarities stroke crossovers that you found that worked really, really well, or did you just sort of go with what you had and it seemed to work well for you?
I think that, the reality is I probably did change my setup a little bit, just to deal with the flowing water. And I think the colour of the water also has an impact. So was very happy to go and fish a DI6 or a DI7 and a short leader, particularly if the water was a bit coloured and there was more flow. Typically the best day I had last year out on the reservoirs was fishing a floating line and a 15-foot leader and a small jig fly. Putting a load of distance between the fly line and the fly and fishing nice and slow and catching actually on the hang quite a lot. But, the pike were tricky that day. But that method worked, an absolute treat. But equally, I'm more than happy fishing a 4 or 5 foot leader on the Y with the DI6 and just getting it down. I've found that scaling up on the fly size in moving water seems to be my go-to method. So probably generally fish smaller flies on big still waters, and then on the rivers I'm scaling up to kind of 9-10 inch patterns. Not sure why, maybe using the movement in the water, and obviously fishing a much slower. But yeah, those are probably the main differences. Happy to go shorter leader and heavier fly line, bigger fly on the rivers than but yeah, preferred method definitely on the reservoirs is a floating line if I get the opportunity. But equally, on the rivers, I think we've got to be aware that if the water's clear, pike are going to travel further, and they may be going for a longer leader. You can get away with an intermediate or a DI3 certainly, as opposed to DI6. But it's something I've really found particularly on the reservoirs. On the best days I've had have been when I've been fishing higher in the water, and I know that if the pike are coming up to take a fly on a floating line, I've been fishing Rodney's scruffy tiger, a foot below the surface, 2 foot below the surface. They're a predator. They're looking up. If they're in the mood, they're going to travel. And I actually think the worst thing you can do is be fishing below them. When the pike are really up in the water and actively hunting, why do you want to be fishing a DI6 or a DI3 and really counting it down? Pike's not going to go down to take a fish, so they're eyes at the top of the head. So, with those days when I get the sense that they're on, I'll always be fishing a floating line on the still water. And then if it's getting a bit harder and feel I'm grinding out, it's a bit slower, then I'm dropping the density or increasing the density of the fly line in and trying to get down to them. So yeah, no, it's fascinating the difference between the rivers and the lakes. But yeah, just happy to go bigger flies and down a bit deeper generally as a rule.
Nice.
Or try to get down. The rivers aren't super deep.
Yeah, got you. And what are you fishing? 9 and 10 weight rods, I guess.
Yeah. Absolutely a mix between the two. Probably having a bit more fun on the 9 weight on the Y. I mean, there are obviously big fish in there. The chances of connecting probably a little bit smaller than fishing some of the big reservoirs, where definitely fishing a 10 weight. But happy to change between the two. Definitely started my journey on fly fishing for pike a very, very long time ago now. Fishing 8 weights up on Langorse, and that was fine. But when you're catching a fish over 20 pounds, then to be honest, I'd rather be on a 10. 9 can definitely handle them, but it just depends on the size of the fly you're casting and obviously length of leader. 10 weight's probably a bit easier, in all honesty. A bit less effort to chuck those big flies. That's more the issue. 9 weight will handle a 20-pound pike, but it's just that all day casting huge flies that are wind resistant. 10 generally makes it a little bit easier.
Perfect. That's music to my ears. music to my ears. I like that. Yeah, heavier fly line as well. So it makes a hell of a lot of sense. You touched on leaders. While I've got you, I know there'll be people listening who do a little bit of pike on the fly. Can you just explain to me, I know you talked about leader lengths, but what about the tippet? What are you using for tippet, and how should people be thinking about attaching the trace of whatever you're using to the fly and the leader? How are you doing that, and how long is that tippet?
So typically I'm just using 40 pounds straight through, but through to either 30 or 26 pound wire. So been using the Rio wire bite at 30 pounds is generally the right thickness. Obviously that's going to break before the fly line as well when you're using the 40 pound leader. But I like being able to just, the last thing I want to do is risk leaving a fly in a fish. So I'm just more than happy to go with that, that really heavy leader strength. I talked about this to one of my Canadian friends, and he, obviously you've got the line records over there, and he couldn't believe it. He was like, "Oh my God, what are you doing, Philistine?" But I'd much rather be on the heavy side. In terms of leader length, as I said, the best day I had last year was fishing a 15-foot leader on a floating line, and they were picky that day. But Rodney was fishing a standard leader length and at a bigger fly, and barely got a touch, and I had 7 fish between 19.5 and 32.5, which it was just a ridiculous day. It was 7 fish for 161 pounds, and they were 3 of them taking the fly on the drop, and it was a 4-inch fly and just fluttering down through the water. So that was pretty special, and that literally was all about leader length and size of fly. But they were locked onto bait fish, and for whatever reason, the falling fly through the water was doing the trick. But yeah, just knotting it to Rio wire bite and then having a fast dash clip on the end. It took me a while to work that one out, actually. I was rather naive and just spending an absolute fortune on Rio wire bite when I was kind of fairly new to the sport, just changing my fly about 5 times an hour and knotting it with the Rio wire bite, which is quite, not the cheapest. But yeah, the fast dash clips are complete game changers once you get them on, and you're just much easier to chop and change flies. Although, the best days you invariably don't end up changing the fly. That's the other thing I've come to realize after doing this for a while. The quality of your fishing is directly proportional to the number of times you change your fly. And if I can have a day where I'm not changing my fly, it's generally been quite a good one.
Fantastic. I remember, I'm sure you're similar, when American Fishing Wire came out onto the market and you could get it over here, and I nearly passed out with excitement because you could easily, you had something you could knot really, really easily, and you didn't need to crimp anything. You didn't need to do anything. But like you say, you'd be snipping up, and it wasn't cheap, and you didn't get a lot when it first came out. And yeah, it just reminded me of that then. And funnily enough, you say about the fish looking up as well, reminded me years back on the Somerset levels, and our village fishing club, it's more coarse fishing, and I used to go along there, and we'd have a meeting. It was a bit Vicar of Dibley in a nice way. I mean that in a really nice way. But we had members who were like some of the people on Vicar of Dibley, but some kids there, and I took up a bunch of materials and said, "Look, I'm going pike fishing tomorrow. You choose the materials. I'll tie a fly," and I tied a banger type pattern. And I remember throwing this thing out, moving it once, and the water exploded. And I've never forgotten that. Goodness knows how many years ago that was. And the fish left. I didn't land the fish. It was briefly on. I don't know who was the more surprised, but it left a tooth in that foam head. It was a Rainey's popper head that I'd put the other way round to make it a banger, or a slider head, I guess it must have been. And there was a tooth in there, and I've still got that fly with the tooth in. But like you say, yeah, they're much easier for them to come up for it. But it's something I've not forgotten in a long time. They're special moments, aren't they?
No, they're the best. I've always said that, any pike off the top, or particularly on a popper, is almost worth, well, at least 2, if not 5 subsurface fish. And I remember one vividly. I'd just come back from, was in the Bahamas actually. I'd been away for a few weeks and caught some bonefish when I was at 18, 19, but came back and went to fish langurs with my dad. And we were out, we used to love going out in May, June, going out early in the morning. We always used to pick the flat, calm days. And we were out there about 7 o'clock in the morning, and we were kind of fishing amongst the lily pads. And I had this popper, and it had a little black head and just some red and white bucktail. But we were about 150 yards away from where this big old splash had taken place. And Dad said, "Oh, that's a big fish hunting over there." So he got on the outboard, probably on the outboard, and motored over there. Dad motored over, and he said it was about here. So I just had this cast and just went strip, 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 and then out of nowhere, this like crocodile's head just came straight out and just it missed, but just came clean out of the water. And I was like, "Whoa, oh my God." So quickly just slapped the fly back in the water, strip, strip. And then this thing came again and connected with it. And it was a 20-pound pike in 5 or 6 foot of water, just coming straight out and taking this popper. And I'll never forget it as long as I live. And for langurs, a 20-pound pike is a really, really significant fish. And this thing was towing the boat around. But that was on this tiny little popper, and that became my go-to popper then for langurs. And by the end, it was barely more than a black piece of foam with a couple of bits of bucktail, but it just had this nice little action that must have looked, really resembled a frog. But yeah, those popper takes, or those surface takes with the pike are just, so exhilarating. And I think, you've got to get the right conditions. Some days you can go there and think, oh, this is going to happen. And then they're just not switched onto it. And obviously it's dependent on whether it's ducklings or frogs or, whatever they're switched onto at the time. But, those days when they are on, it's, to me, you don't get much better fishing than that in the UK. So yeah, lots of fond memories of popper fishing for pike. Definitely.
Nice. I like that. And it's interesting you mentioned you fishing with your dad. Do you come from a family of anglers, and was it a natural progression as a result of that, if you did, that fishing was always going to be in your life?
Yeah, so we grew up on a farm in South Wales, just near Abergavenny, and the River Honddu, which flows into the Monnow, flows along the bottom of the farm. So we've got 2 little stretches. So fishing has just been an intrinsic part of my life from, since I was 3 or 4. Dad always fished. Probably doesn't have the same passion as I do for it. He's like quite a very casual angler. He's a good angler. Rodney and I always joke. He comes out twice a year and ends up inevitably catching the biggest fish, or came and fished our multi-species competition 2 years ago and was the only person to catch all 4 species and just won that. So he's got very lazy. I'm always on at him for not using his left hand when he casts. I'm like, "Come on, Dad," and he's just puts it out, nice slow retrieve, and just picks up lots of fish. So there's definitely angling heritage here. But I started, when some of my fondest memories are going down to the river with Dad. Whether it was a bit of worming or maybe a bit of spinning. But my first ever fish, actually, it was my sister's birthday. I think she was 2 or 3, and I was either 4 or 5 at the time. And they'd bought Sean some presents, and to make me not feel left out, they bought me a little fishing rod. So it was a toy fishing rod. So we'd gone down to the field, and Dad had gone off to check the sheet, but he'd put a bit of line on and put the float on and a worm on, walked off. Next thing he knows, turns around and I'm screaming, "Dad, Dad!" And hilariously, there was a trout farm about half a mile downstream, and when it would flood, the rainbows would escape. So we used to have like a population of rainbows in the Honddu. And I was like, "Dad, I've got a fish!" And he turns around and charges back down. In the meantime, the line snapped, but the float was still there. So Dad's dived into the river and basically hand-lined this 2-pound rainbow trout in. So that was kind of my introduction. My first ever fish was as a 3 or 4 year old, and Dad diving into the river. So I think when you've got experiences like that, it kind of sets you up for a lifetime in fishing, which is inevitably what's happened since the age of 4. And catching those first fish. So yeah, lots of fond early memories in that sense.
Has it surprised your dad how deeply fishing has impacted your life? Is he sort of fascinated to see that, like you say, he's a lot more relaxed about his fishing, and you strike me as incredibly relaxed about it, but you're doing it a lot, and a lot of your life is now revolving around fishing to a bigger degree. Has that surprised him, and is he a little bit proud?
Yeah, I guess so. Mum and Dad have always, been very supportive of everything I did. I guess it was a natural transition from squash, which, formed the basis of my, fundamentally my life. I've been involved in squash at high levels for 30 years now. So I was a professional player, and Mum and Dad were completely supportive throughout my teenage years and then through to, my professional career. But yeah, it was no coincidence that I got an injury. I tore my hamstring off my pelvis when I was about 24, 25. And I lost my lottery funding at that point, and then started squash coaching, and then went on to start the two companies, or the company that I've got now, which is all in online squash. But it was at that kind of transitional point where the passion for squash as a professional athlete, waned and transitioned into, a purely business sense. But that was the point that then fishing kind of took over as the passion. And I guess it's, for me, it's a real shift away from what I do day to day. It's literally the antithesis of squash, which is in a concrete box, it's super competitive, and you're in 4 walls and you're boxed in. And I'm at my happiest now when I'm out on a beach or on a river, surrounded by nobody, ideally on my own, just surrounded by nature. And, so I think it's the opposite to what I've been doing, I was doing in those formative years. And then now I'm still very heavily involved in squash. But all my time is spent on computers, staring into a computer screen, managing like online coaching and this online rating system that we have. So it's quite funny. We always get asked about using fish finders, because Rodney and I, we don't really use them, or we don't use them at all, actually. And I think part of the reason for that is that I spend so much of my time staring at screens. The last thing I want to do when I go out on a lake is be staring at a screen. I'd rather, just try and figure it out. And I'm sure probably, we catch less fish at times potentially, but equally, trying to work out the structure, or trying to catch, figure out where the bait fish are, or, get a sense of places that have worked before. I'd rather work that way than necessarily just be staring at the screen all the time and, going that way. So, back to your original question about being surprised. They're probably not surprised, because it's, whatever I do, I tend to go deep on it. I did that with squash, and, with music and DJing, and then, the same things happened with fishing now. That's just become the passion. And, I'm not somebody who just has lots of hobbies and ticks along at them. I'd rather fully immerse myself in it and, really figure it out. So I guess that's what I've done with fishing ultimately.
And was it difficult to transition? Because I know you're being incredibly modest, and I know that you played squash to just about the highest level that you can. Was it difficult to transition from being ultra competitive to the sort of angler that I'm sensing that you are, that is the antithesis of that? Would that be correct? And was it difficult to do that and not make it something competitive? Or was fishing something that took you out of the competitive arena, as it were?
I think it did. It took me out of the competitive arena, and that's what I really love about it. we run some competitions as fluff chuckers. Rodney does a fantastic job of putting those events on. For me, they're always a bit of fun, and it's the social that I'm interested in. It's a bonus if you do well and pick up a fishing rod for winning an event, but that's not why I would ever enter a fishing competition. For me, the essence of a fishing competition just goes against everything that I do it for. I am competitive. I am fiercely competitive, but not in the fishing realm. And I like it. My whole life was geared around being competitive and winning or not losing. And I don't mind. I don't see it as a loss to the fish. When if you have a blank, you have a tough day, and that just makes the good days better. I don't, it's not really a loss. And yeah, I'm quite happy to be away from that competitive component in this aspect of my life completely. I've done far too much being upset about a result or a performance, and not having that in fishing is great.
Yeah. Great. Nice answer. The reason I asked was that it was making me think about the program Ian Botham had on fishing. And I think he was fishing with Mike Atherton, the Tweed, or I think it was the Tweed. And he said to Mike Atherton, I love it. I love fishing because it's competitive. And to me, I couldn't quite understand that. And I know we're all different, but somebody similar that has played to the very highest levels, he couldn't turn off that competitive switch. And that's why I was interested to ask that question. And it seems as though you're able to do that incredibly well. And I'm the same, that I'm in some aspects incredibly competitive, but when it comes to fishing, I take pleasure in other people catching fish. I wouldn't, let's say we were fishing langurs together in a boat and you hooked a fish and you hooked another one and you hooked it. I wouldn't be upset about it. I'd be trying to figure out what was happening, but I wouldn't resent somebody catching fish and I wasn't, sort of thing. So kudos for you for being able to turn that off, because I'm guessing that must be a difficult thing to do, but is easier over time, isn't it?
Yes, it's, as I said, I haven't been able to turn it off in every aspect of my life. If we're playing darts or having a game of pool or, whatever it might be, there's that competitive edge does kick in. But yeah, hilariously, it's just happened probably in the last year on the squash court. And I think that's just me coming to terms with the fact that I'm getting older. And it's a real, that is a challenge, I think, of being a kind of a high level sportsman, to then see your body starting to deteriorate and starting to lose matches to players who, you can be a better squash player, but a worse athlete than younger players, right? So that was a frustration, playing against people that you knew you were actually better than and then losing. But now I've got a couple of dodgy hips. I need surgery on a hip. But I'm still playing for my local team, more for the social side of things, really. But I've just had to come to terms with the fact that I'm not a very good squash player anymore, and accept losing fundamentally. Because if I go and get frustrated about losing on that Thursday night to somebody that I know I should be, it's going to be a miserable Thursday night. It's going to take the edge off the social side of things. So just kind of transition to that point within squash as well. But yeah, that took a while to do. As somebody who is naturally competitive, definitely.
Yeah, it must be. I was thinking, like you say, the time of those changes and a realization, and I guess a coming to terms with, isn't it? That and it happens to all top athletes, and even I'm no athlete, but I could play cricket a little bit, and knowing I can't do stuff like that anymore. It must be, from an elite athlete point of view, a difficult thing to go from the peak and then see that peak and look down the other side. Is that, like you say, what was that time frame for you to do that? Did you realize it, or were you aware of it, or you just suddenly said, right, I understand this now?
It's an interesting one. I think my level probably fell away a fair bit quicker than other people, just because I was professional squash and then transitioned to living in Bristol actually, and carved out kind of another career as a promoter and DJ, which was a fun side of life that I obviously hadn't really experienced as a professional squash player, and then was focused on the online coaching business. So there was like a lack of time to train, and I wasn't playing as regularly. So there's often people's level will taper off. They don't necessarily just stop. They keep training, keep ticking along. But I think I had to come to terms with the fact that my level fell off pretty quickly because I just didn't continue to train after the injury and didn't continue to put the same kind of time and energy in. But that kind of competitiveness was definitely still there for a while. The losses still used to hurt, but as I say, I think transitioned away from that now because I'm so far off the pace. But that's definitely an age thing. You could kind of get away with it in your late 20s, but late 30s, if you're not training and not doing the work, then you get found out pretty quickly. So
yeah, nice answer. I read recently that somebody said that your 20s are for free, and I keep telling my daughter that as well, so to enjoy those. But I wanted to ask as well, moving back onto fishing, that your first fish was a rainbow trout from the river. Are salmonoids on the radar in quite the same way for you? Do you enjoy that as much as pike? We're going to come on saltwater in a moment, but a salmonoid fish, trout, grayling, salmon of interest to you? Is that something that takes up a portion of your time, but perhaps not as big as pike and saltwater stuff?
So over the last 2 years, brown trout have really become of great interest on the mono. I joined the Galway club on the mono 2 seasons ago. So through that first lockdown, I was super close. So I was able to wander down and got a lot of fishing in there, and really do appreciate dry fly fishing and the technical. And it was, I think that the permit trip when I did my 6 weeks in Mexico 2.5 years ago, there was a realization that I was casting a long way. And my pike casting, I was covering lots of water, but that kind of pinpoint accuracy at permit, kind of close range wasn't quite there. So I thought, well, this, the river fishing, the brown trout fishing is going to be an opportunity to really improve that. So there was almost like this technical reason for going to pursue brown trout, and in doing so, completely fell in love with it and fell in love with the subtleties of it that don't necessarily exist within the fly fishing for pike. So yeah, the last 2 seasons, done a lot on the mono, a little bit on the Usk. And then, historically been up to Scotland a little bit, have caught salmon on the fly. I think I've caught 3 salmon, but nothing massive, up to about 8 pounds. And then so I managed to win the saltwater fly fishing festival on the mullet competition, and won a recon rod, and it was the 6 weight, but I already had a 6 weight, so managed to swap that for a nymphing rod. So kind of got into Euro nymphing and French leadering over the last season, and been trying to figure that out. Actually probably spent more time French leadering for barbel on the Y last summer, which was a new challenge and completely different to anything I'd ever done. Euro nymphing with a 6 weight and then actually up to an 8 weight because there's some, obviously chunky barbel in there. So yeah, that's quite new to me. And then this winter just done a bit of grayling with the French leader setup. So that is quite new, but do really enjoy it a lot. I forgot my net. It was really frustrating. Had an absolute beauty of a grayling just coming to hand. I was just pulling the leader in, and it was 2.5 pound plus on the mono, which was a cracking fish. And unfortunately lost that the other day. So I've definitely got the grayling bug this winter. But yeah, super excited about getting out now after the brown trout, and the mayfly fishing there is just just phenomenal. So rainbows. Probably, I've struggled with the stocked fishing rainbow trout. It just hasn't appealed to me in the same way. I like the wild fishing. I like the hunting component, and fishing for stocked fish just hasn't quite kind of caught the imagination in the same way. But being out on the river and again figuring it out, and that accuracy of presenting a dry fly, absolutely adore.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. So you've talked about Mexico and saltwater and what it means to you. Where did that part of that component of your fishing begin? And was that a quick, yes, this is for me moment? Where did you start your saltwater overseas? And well, let's go overseas first because you mentioned Mexico. But where did that begin for you? And does that passion burn just as bright still?
Yeah, absolutely. Obsessed. I think if you were ultimately going to give me one more day's fishing tomorrow, if you said tomorrow is your last day's fishing on the planet, it would be going and doing DIY permit off the beach. That's probably as good as it gets for me. But it all started kind of when I got into fly fishing really as a 13-year-old, reading the magazines and or picking up a book, and suddenly you'd hear about bonefish. And I was like, wow, this looks amazing. The fastest fish going, and I would love to go and do that. And my granddad was a surgeon in the RAF, and he used to get stationed all around the world. And he spent a lot of time in Christmas Island. So he used to talk about, and he used to talk about going off bone fishing then. So there was this, these stories were being told, and just that caught my imagination. And he'd actually bought an acre of land in the Bahamas as an investment in the 70s. And there was always this, it was kind of this mythical place that Grandad's got this plot of land, and we should always go and see what it's about. So when I was 15, I actually went on a holiday, just me and him, to go and look at this plot of land in Exuma. And we went off for a week and packed the fishing rods, but they got lost on the plane, which was an absolute nightmare, just lost on the way over. So we ended up borrowing a rod, and it wasn't great, but we ended up having a guided day out on a skiff, and they provided the rods, and we went out and we caught some bonefish. But it wasn't, certainly wasn't a fantastic week of fishing. It was a nice time to spend, with my granddad as a 15-year-old. But that kind of sparked the interest, and actually hooked a barracuda, which just blew my mind at the time when we were trolling out the back with a lure, and it came 8 feet out the air and through the hook. But that kind of sparked the interest in saltwater, just catching, a handful of bones. And then when I was 18, was going to have a break between school and university. And went off, was looking at things to do, and found this expedition, which was a diving expedition in Andros. So it was going to be a month of diving in Andros. And I wasn't a diver, but thought, this sounds like a conservation project. I was thinking about doing zoology at university. This ticks a load of boxes. But really, in all honesty, at the back of my mind, I was just thinking I can definitely get my 4-piece in the suitcase here and spend a month in Andros. So we were in Andros, and because we were all beginner divers, we'd be quite dependent on the wind, and we could only go out if the wind was relatively light, and we could get in and out of the water. And just a really good chunk of that month, we were just blown out, so we just couldn't go out diving. So I suddenly had all this spare time, and I was like, oh, do you mind if I just go and have an explore and take my rod? So I ended up just going off and just bone fishing for quite a lot of the month on my own in Andros, and caught some fantastic bonefish up to about 6 pounds. But that was as an 18-year-old, so just felt obviously super fortunate to be able to go and do that. But that definitely sparked an interest at that time. But then, in all honesty, you're suddenly a young a young 20-year-old squash player or 22-year-old squash player, with no cash and international travel to go off and do fly fishing trips just wasn't a thing. So it wasn't until I was probably 31, 32. When I got married, actually, we went off to the Maldives for a honeymoon and snuck the fly rod in over there. Caught bluefin trevally. Was hopeful to go and catch GTs, but it just wasn't happening where we were. So did a little bit there, scratched the itch. But then it wasn't till this trip to Mexico. Went with my now ex-wife, and we did 15 days in Mexico, and clearly planned to do quite a lot of fishing. So went off to Bocapaya, and then booked a couple of days guided out in Ascension Bay. So that was where it all started. Probably did more fishing than I should have. I'm not sure the ex-wife was super happy. But yeah, was determined to catch a permit. That was the thing that, suddenly the reading of Bonefish, then it was suddenly all about catching a permit. And these mythical creatures, these beautiful creatures, really wanted to go and do that. And it was frustrating. On the first morning, we went out 2 days back to back out of Punta Allen, and I was up on the platform, and one guide next to me, and obviously the guy poling at the back, and then looked out, and I was just like, "Is that a permit?" And both the guides were like, "Oh yeah." So cast at this fish and just went strip. The fish, the permit ate, and I had it in my mind that I had to strip strike, because I'd been up at Holbox actually as well. I had one day up there and was going to do some tarpon fishing. Didn't connect with any tarpon, but was very much on there. You've got to strip strike these fish. So I really did this strong strip strike on this permit just as it turned and pinged off, and just 16-pound leader just exploded. And I was like, no, people spend years trying to catch a permit, and there it was, first cast, and I've spotted it myself, thinking this is it. So that, then I had those 2 days and fluffed numerous other shots and didn't connect with the permit at all over 2 days, and kind of remember feeling on the drive back to Punta Allen, as we went back on the boat, just feeling really wounded at the fact that I'd had my shot and I'd spent so much time thinking about catching this fish, and it didn't happen. So I definitely kind of put them up on a pedestal, and then went back to normal life. And actually, unfortunately, my marriage broke down in that period, and I'd been working pretty hard on the business for quite some time, and thought, what, we sold the house and just thought this is a good opportunity to go and reset. So I booked a trip to Mexico for 6 weeks, just to go and regroup, kind of as your marriage breaks up, and thought, well, this is a nice opportunity to go and do this. And that's really where the love of saltwater fishing came from. So I was between Mahawal down with Nick Dembo. He showed me around a bit, and then I was out into, I could just jump in the car and go and decide what species I wanted to catch, where I wanted to go, what rod I wanted to use, how many beers I was going to take. And I fished for 32 days straight, I think, in Mexico. And, I was catching barracuda, jack crevalle, bonefish, permit, snook. And we had a week in Punta Allen guided, after I'd done 10, 12 days with Nick. We went up to Punta Allen, Rodney came across. And I hadn't caught permit at, I had caught permit at this point, sorry. So I caught a couple of DIY permit, but we went out on this one day and we just came across this school of huge permit, 15 to 30 pounders. They were kind of over relatively deep water. Actually, there was a wreck, but they were just cruising over the top, and we had multiple drifts. And just couldn't get one to eat. And then suddenly it was like this one last drift back across them, and eventually made this cast and stripped this crab pattern in. Line went tight and ended up catching this. It the 16 to 18 pound permit, I guess, and had the most tremendous fight. But that was probably, there was literally 18 months of dreaming from that period when we'd been to Mexico on that holiday, thinking, I really want to catch a permit and something to hold this most glorious looking fish that fought like an absolute demon. Was that was probably one of the happiest fishing memories I've got, because it was months of planning and hyping this fish up, which they're a gorgeous looking fish, but they're finicky and challenging and pretentious jacks, I think, is what Nick and I described them as. And to actually hold a really significant one in my hand was a delight. So that was where the kind of passion for permit took hold, and then subsequently had another trip. But for me, it doesn't get any better than the DIY stuff. So, in Mahawal, under the guidance of Nick, he set me up and showed me the marks and taught me through techniques. But to just be wading in knee-deep water on your own, just sight fishing, and you spot that black fin, or you spot the little flash or whatever it is, and trying to figure it out. And it all happens so quickly, because they're on the hunt, they're zigzagging in along the beach, and then you make your cast, and doing it all yourself, or catching on your. I caught one actually on my own fly. I'm definitely not a great fly tire, and don't do a huge amount. But one night, we'd spun up this pattern, and catching a permit on your own, DIY on your own fly. I was like, this is life's good. This is the fish for me. So yeah, that's kind of where the salt stuff started. Yeah.
Nice. That's a lovely story. Pretentious Jack, I love, and I'm going to steal. I think that's the finest. They are an extraordinary fish. And yeah, I've not experienced, as you say, such a pernickety, difficult fish that you have many shots at and nothing happens, but you remember that moment when, like you say, when it goes tight. And fabulous fish. So I get that passion is still burning equally as brightly as it ever has done, and fully understand it. For anyone listening, actually, if you've thought about bone fishing or permit, I think Ascension Bay is one of the great places to learn your trade, and to have a go at those. And I know the Bahamas, I fished as well. Little tiny bit more technical, would you say, Jethro? But Ascension has everything, doesn't it? From barracuda to snook to permit to tarpon, everything else in the mix as well. It's a great place for people to consider if they're sort of bonefish plus curious, isn't it? That's a good place to go, isn't it?
100%. I just think Mexico, actually, in general. So obviously you've got Ascension Bay out to Punta Allen on the guided stuff. Getting out on the skiff, for variety, it doesn't get any better. You can go and target baby tarpon under the mangroves for a bit of the morning. Then the next thing you know, you can be casting a 6-weight at bones, or then you can be out, spotting permit. I would go one step further and say that the fishing in Mahawal with Nick is, that's south of Ascension Bay. And if you want a kind of a lower cost DIY trip, or with a bit of guided, then that can offer excellent value. It's a different type of fishing, walk and wade, and you are dependent on the weather a little bit more. If you're out on a skiff, obviously the guides can get you into spots, but if there is no better fishing for me than that beach wading when you've got a 1-foot swell, and there's no sand being stirred up, and the waves are so small that you've got the visibility. That is just truly out of this world. And then with Nick, he also has a small little boat that you can go in and do the inner lagoons and the inner lakes and do the tarpon then as well. So if the beach days are good, we would go and target the permit. But if they weren't and it was a blowout, you could end up being in the lakes and I mean, we say baby tarpon. I lost one probably 50 to 60 pounds in the lakes one day, and it's just a really, really magic spot. So I'd strongly recommend checking that out, especially if you don't want to kind of go for the full board and lodging that you might experience down in Ascension Bay, but both equally great and huge variety. I mean, you can add triggerfish in there as well, and obviously Jack Crevalle. I think for me, one of the most underrated sports fish in the sea, in the tropical waters. I went off to Costa Rica actually this winter with the hope of doing DIY rooster fish, which didn't quite pan out. Fishing the Pacific coast, it's not as clear. You're not sight fishing in quite the same way, but did get out to likely looking spots, river mouths, rocky points, whatever it is, and did catch fish, caught a snook. I caught a few Jack Crevalle, up to about 15, 16 pounds. Hijacked a snorkeling trip actually. We're on a guided snorkeling trip, and there's a common theme here, Pete, of me sneaking my fishing
I've got
rod
it
into but did lose one fish. It was so frustrating. I went out at 7:00 one morning, and there was kind of like some fresh water running into the sea, and was out there, and there were a few bait fish moving, and I just had a Clouser minnow on a 9 weight, and cast out, stripping back, thinking I might pick up a snook. And then line just went tight, huge explosion of water, but never saw any fins. And next thing you know, this thing just charged out to sea and just like emptied my spool. And I actually had a hitch. It was so stupid. I hadn't checked. Had a little hitch in the backing, so it was going clunk, stop, clunk, stop, clunk. And I had 25-pound leader on, and this thing just kept going. And it was 220 yards of backing on the 9 weight. Unfortunately, I had the 10 in the hotel. And I still don't know what it was. Like, a couple of people have said it's definitely a rooster, the way it just shot off in a straight line out to sea, no zigzags, and just this raw power. And it just stopped with about 10 turns left on the reel. I thought, yes, I think I can stop you here. Wound in couple, and it just held. And I was like, come on, and it just wouldn't give them just serious weight. And then it just went again, and then blew up 25-pound leader. So I never quite saw what it was. Nick thought it could be a huge jack, but then other people who caught roosters out there said, I think it was probably a rooster. So that was wounding, because that was like my new permit going out to Costa Rica. I really want to catch a DIY rooster, and I had a couple of days out on a boat. Did hire a panga, and kind of went out with the bait fishermen and the chucking live baits over. So it's definitely not geared up for fly fishing. So we were trying to figure it out. Can we go to the rooster spot and then maybe chuck a popper out and see what happens? But it wasn't quite perfect. It was definitely much trickier than Mexico. But I think roosters. Yeah, there's going to be this, in the same way that the permit obsession kind of materialized after losing one. I think that's pretty high up on my hit list. And looking at the west, out in Baja, the west coast of Mexico, I think that marries everything together: the sprinting down the beach, the sight fishing, the hunting, the speed, the accuracy that needs to be there. So that's next on the hit list. Have you done any? Have you done any
not rooster. I had Matt Harris on here actually, and we talked about them, and we talked about Running Down the Man, the seminal fly fishing film, I think, that changed fly fishing. And we agreed it was probably the most beautiful fish there is to catch. And this it brings us around quite nicely that I'm now at the age where Running Down the Man, I think limping or trotting at best. I'd be trotting down the man, actually.
Hobbling down the man.
Yeah. Or a brisk walk down the man after roosterfish. So I've come to terms. It was something I really, really wanted to do. Unfortunately, I'm unable to do that now, and I would love to be able to do it. And I still think about it. And every now and again, I watch Frank and those other people doing that. And it was an extraordinary experience. And I think one day I'd like to, in some way, shape or form, tick off roosterfish as a fish. I don't think casting blind to them personally, it's only me, I'm similar, it doesn't really interest me. I'd rather stalk them in some way, shape or form. So that's where I stand on that. It was interesting where you talked about the Jack Crevalle and your reel being emptied. And I was on an exploratory trip, oh, goodness knows how many years ago now, 15, 16, 17 years, to Managua in the Bahamas. And first morning, none of us had really done any bone fishing. I cast out and something picked up the clouser and we were just casting into the surf. And it just emptied my reel, took the fly line. I had one cast with this fly line, and then I never saw it again. And it just emptied, and it was gone on the first morning. One of my fly lines was completely gone. So I suspect they were trying to the locals were trying, permit, or palometa, or whatever they was calling them at the time. But I don't think it was. I think it probably was a jack. And this thing, there was just nothing. We stood there and watched it. So what do we do? Because you couldn't lean into it, you couldn't do anything. It just emptied the reel, took the fly line off somewhere on a reef, way out wherever it was, and it was gone. But yeah, I think it was probably those jacks. But it's been fascinating getting an insight into your saltwater career as well. And I want you to bring us back round towards Pike, because recently I thoroughly enjoyed watching the film you've been in and helped put together, Taith. Can you tell us a little bit about it? And can you explain why it's called Taith and what that actually means, please?
Sure. So Taith means journey in Welsh. So I've got some Welsh heritage. My mum is from North Wales, and I've obviously grown up in Wales. So I thought it was a nice nod towards that. Obviously, the film, the first part of the film is filmed up in Trawsfynydd in northwest Wales, and then the second part, or the last part of the trip, is filmed on Chew. So there is this journey through the heart of Wales, which is fundamentally where the name comes from. I spent a lot of time thinking about it and what would make sense and what would link up, and was just typing words into Google Translate and thinking, and then typed in journey, and then that came up, and I was like, bingo. So yeah, that's where the name came from. But it, that film came about through our relationship with Orvis and Claire, from Claire Zambuni and the Saltwater Fly Fishing Festival. Over the last couple of years, we've developed really strong relationships with them and close bonds and close friendships with Claire, and Rodney and I have done a bit with Orvis over the last couple of years, and then Squash Skills, which is one of my businesses. It's an online squash coaching platform. We make coaching content, and people subscribe to the content, but as part of that, we make documentaries as well. So I've been working with James, who works for me at Squash Skills, making documentaries for a few years, and at the back of my mind, there's always been this desire to create a fishing documentary. And suddenly the opportunity presented itself with Orvis. I said to Claire, look, we've got a production company. Why don't we make this happen? I think we can. I think there's a good story in here, or potentially a good story in here. In all honesty, I think we got lucky. In that we didn't quite know what the story was going to be. Like any fishing film, right? You never know how it's gonna pan out. But we kind of went up there and just shot what happened, and then we're going to try and figure out, how it's stitched together as a film. But it was great. I'd certainly never directed a fishing film, and James had never shot on water or filmed on a boat. So tons of challenges. And it really was run and gun, and in all honesty, I think we were totally winging it, in that it was, one man in his camera equipment and us, mic'd up and trying to, create a story. But ultimately, I think we have. I think the premise of it was, can we showcase what fly fishing for pike is about, and catching big wild fish here in the UK, but then also can we help Claire and Scott catch their first pike on the fly? And that was kind of what the challenge was, to catch them their first fish, whilst showcasing what this was about. And, ultimately the story kind of unfolded as it did. And, I had a good first day and caught a nice big fish on the first day. And then the second day was rock hard, and the weather changed and it was tricky. The third day, Scott got his first fish. And then, Chew was fishing fantastically last year. It was pretty wild, actually, in terms of just the number of jacks that were there. And obviously you always got a chance for big fish. We talked about a pike party happening at Chew, and that was a spin-off of one of the days we had with Nick when we were out fishing for tarpon in one of the lakes in Mexico. He always used to talk about a tarpon party. He'd say, "Oh, yesterday it was like a tarpon party here. It was like a tarpon party." And I remember being out on the boat with him one day, and he was talking about this tarpon party, and I was just like, "I want to go to a tarpon party," and I want to be invited. So that kind of became a bit of a hangover into the film. We talked about going to Chew and it being a pike party. And then it was, and we were actually joined by Nick, which was really nice. And he caught 8 or 9 fish, and then Rodney, who had actually had a really tough 3 days, he blanked for 3 days at Traws, and was actually getting a bit despondent. He kind of took it to heart a little bit and was feeling the pressure. And then suddenly on the last afternoon, I won't spoil the film, but the boy did good, I guess. And the film came together. So I think we got lucky. The weather was good, and but we had to be in it to win it, I guess. And I think I'm pretty proud of the results. I think it's a really nice film that does showcase what we do and why we do it ultimately.
Yeah, I would echo that. It's beautifully shot, beautifully put together. The reaction from Rodney is worth it. I won't give any more away, having watched it myself, but was thrilled for him as well. And that is one of the things, isn't it? You thrust a camera in front of people, and there is a pressure, isn't there, no matter what, and you've just got to believe in what you're doing and sticking with it, don't you? And it will pay off. If you know your trade, it's going to pay off. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer, but there is, sometimes you do have to do that, don't you? And you have to stick at it and believe in yourself and not worry about it, and it will come right if you know what you're doing, won't it?
I think so. In the film, Rodney alludes to the idea of grinding it out on the big waters, and that can be some days what you have to do. And he also points out that it wouldn't be fun if every day was easy, right? And there wasn't an element of a challenge there. I think the worst thing you can do is just keep chopping and changing when things aren't working, and trying something different, or you heard somebody caught on a purple fly and you've never fished a purple fly in your life for pike, but then you're fishing a purple fly, or and what Rodney said, it's about grinding it out. It's about covering the water, covering the likely spots. We fished too hard that day, and then we knew there was a head of big pike in a certain area, and we kept going over it, and Rodney kept fishing it, and scruffy tiger, and what he's been doing for the last 3 years, and then sure enough, a good fish comes along. So, I think it's very easy to get caught up when it's tricky and difficult, and go and try and do something off piste. But good anglers keep at it and keep persevering, and the fish don't change behaviours massively month to month or year to year. What worked last year is probably going to work this year, and it's about just staying true to yourself and keeping grinding it out, as Rodney says.
Yeah, keep the faith, people. That's the thing to do, I think. If people haven't seen it and want to see it, where can they find it?
It's on the Explore Orvis website under Taith. I think links obviously on the Fluff Chuckers Facebook page as well. That's a bit of a hub of information. But Explore Orvis is the place to go at the moment.
Fantastic. Jethro, we've spoken for well over an hour now, and we've covered some really wonderful ground. I promised you that we would go off piste, which we have done, and explored lots of, I think we could have carried on for quite some time more, but it's been wonderful chatting with you. Let's throw you one last question. Where's your happy place?
My happy place. Really general happy place, or like really, really, really happy place?
Super happy
general
place.
Happy place.
Yeah.
I think it's wading on a beach in Mexico in knee deep water, trying to spot a permit on my own. As much as I love the social side of fishing, at times, that solitude and that hunt when it's me versus the fish, and I'm trying to figure it out. And I haven't got a guide there spotting fish for me. It's all on me. That's my happy place.
Yeah, it sounds pretty good to me. Warm water on your legs, a tail or two to have a throw at, and we're happy, aren't we? That's wonderful. It's been absolutely fantastic talking with you this morning. I've really, really enjoyed it. How can people get in touch with you? How can people find you, should they want to? Your social media handles and everything else.
Yeah, we're Fluff Chuckers fundamentally, both the Facebook page and then the Instagram. So it's fluff_chuckers on Instagram, and then just facebook.com/fluff chuckers. That's the best place. That we've got a really nice community going on there within the Facebook group. There's a couple of thousand members who are all super willing to share information, to help each other out, to support each other. So we're really proud of that community, and Rodney's been instrumental in growing that. So please do come along, and it's a place to ultimately share tales and share stories and talk about the fish we've caught. So that's a really nice place to be involved. Come and say hi, Ben.
Fantastic. Jethro Binns, it's been brilliant to have you along. Thank you so much for talking with me on the Fly Culture podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
It's been awesome. Everyone, this has been another episode of the Fly Culture podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as me. And if you have, perhaps you'll consider subscribing too. But thanks again, and there'll be plenty more podcasts very, very soon.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter.